Lisbon, 1837, was a city cloaked in perpetual mist, streets winding like serpents under the dim glow of lanterns, each alley carrying whispers of dread. The widow, known to few but feared by all, had been a woman of remarkable beauty, yet her eyes held a shadow that hinted at madness, a darkness that would not fade with morning. Her husband's sudden death had left the town unsettled, but nothing prepared them for what would follow. Rumors spread swiftly, each more horrifying than the last. She was said to speak to unseen entities, summon spirits, and walk among shadows as if the night obeyed her command. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of her laughter echoing through abandoned halls, laughter that curdled blood and left an inexplicable chill. Some claimed she had made a pact with forces beyond human comprehension, a deal sealed in fire and sorrow. On the day of the funeral, Lisbon's sky seemed to darken unnaturally, the clouds pressing close as if the heavens themselves mourned in fearful anticipation. The widow appeared dressed in black garments heavier than grief itself, adorned with arcane symbols drawn in patterns no mortal dared to decipher, symbols older than the city, older than any living memory. Her movements were precise, deliberate, each step resonating with a cadence that unsettled the onlookers, a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of a hidden darkness. Bells tolled in slow, mournful chimes, yet the sound did nothing to pierce the weight of anticipation that hung over the gathering. Flames licked the pyre, their heat mingling with the cold apprehension in the crowd, and then she began to move. The widow danced, her motions defying logic, grief, and every expectation of a widow's sorrow. Each step seemed to draw shadows closer, each twirl igniting sparks of terror and fascination in those who dared to watch. The fire did not consume her as it should have. Instead, it embraced her, twisting and curling around her form as if acknowledging some unholy covenant. Smoke spiraled into grotesque shapes, faces of the damned or perhaps visions conjured by the collective fear of witnesses, their screams lost in the roar of the pyre. The widow's hair shimmered like embers, her gown a living flame that moved with intent, a cursed display of beauty and horror intertwined. No clergy, no elder could intervene. None could rationalize the scene unfolding before them. Fear and awe collided in every mind, hearts pounding in unison with the crackling inferno. As she danced, the widow became something beyond mortal understanding. A spectral figure of grief turned to vengeance, a manifestation of sorrow that had grown into something terrible and magnificent. Onlookers were paralyzed, caught between fleeing and witnessing a phenomenon that would be etched into the city's memory forever. Even as flames licked higher, consuming nothing yet threatening everything, the widow moved with a rhythm that was mesmerizing and horrifying at once. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the ground, warping reality, bending perception and amplifying the terror. The air itself seemed charged, vibrating with the weight of the unknown, of curses that refused to die, of a widow's grief twisted into a spectacle of macabre artistry. As she spun, the fire in her form became indistinguishable, a single entity of rage and sorrow, the cursed widow who defied death and logic alike. Even long after the pyre dimmed, townspeople would whisper of her laughter, echoing through fog-filled streets, a reminder that some curses are eternal, that grief, when twisted by dark forces, does not end in silence but in spectacle, terror, and memory. The city of Lisbon would never forget the widow, nor would it ever fully comprehend the night when grief, fire, and curses danced together, creating a legacy that would haunt generations. Shadows remained in corners long after the flames had died, whispers carried on the wind, and a lingering sense that some horrors cannot be contained, cannot be explained, and refuse to fade with time. The widow's story was no longer one of loss but of transformation, a metamorphosis into something feared, something cursed, something unforgettable. The widow's dance within the inferno was unlike anything Lisbon had ever witnessed. Her movements were precise yet otherworldly, as if the flames themselves obeyed her will, wrapping around her body with reverence rather than consuming her. Onlookers could feel the heat from the pyre searing their skin, yet a strange pull kept them rooted to the spot, eyes glued to the cursed spectacle. Murmurs spread among the crowd. Some claimed the widow was not entirely mortal, that her soul had been claimed by something older, something that had walked the earth long before Lisbon existed. Each rotation of her body stirred the smoke into shapes of grotesque faces, wailing figures, lost spirits trapped between worlds, all seemingly dancing to the rhythm she set. The smell of burning timber mixed with something more metallic, almost copper-like, hinting at a ritual beyond comprehension, a communion with forces that no man dared invoke. Children covered their eyes yet peeked through trembling fingers, drawn irresistibly to the terrifying beauty of the scene. Elders whispered prayers that seemed swallowed by the roar of the fire, their words ineffective against the raw dark power that radiated from the widow. Her gown, a cascade of flames and shadows, moved as though alive, and sparks leaped from it, igniting the air in fleeting harmless bursts that nonetheless made hearts race. It was said that the very earth beneath her feet shivered, acknowledging the unnatural energy she commanded, a force that blurred the line between life and death, reality and nightmare. Those brave enough to stare too long reported visions, glimpses of her husband's face twisted in anguish, shadows of the past mingling with the present, the cursed widow transforming sorrow into an art both beautiful and horrifying. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the widow's dance intensified, the flames growing taller, casting grotesque shadows across the city's rooftops. Some villagers fainted, others screamed in terror, yet all were mesmerized, unable to look away from the macabre performance unfolding before them. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the scent of smoke and something unidentifiable, a foreboding hint of calamity, as if nature itself acknowledged the darkness present. Birds circled above, their cries piercing the thick, smoky air, yet even they seemed hesitant to approach, hesitant to witness the cursed dance. Rumors would later claim that those who stared too long were haunted forever, seeing flickers of fire and the widow's silhouette in their dreams, a mark left on their minds by forces beyond understanding. Scholars who would attempt to document the event found their words inadequate, texts describing the spectacle failing to capture the terror, the elegance, the cursed beauty of what had occurred. The widow's movements became a narrative of grief turned to rage, sorrow turned to defiance, a testament to the unimaginable power of one human soul intertwined with dark forces. Flames coiled and twisted around her like serpents, licking at her skin yet leaving no mark, a supernatural display that mocked the natural order. The crowd's collective fear grew, mingled with awe, each heartbeat a drum echoing against the walls of history that would remember this night forever. When the fire finally began to wane, the widow's final spin sent sparks into the sky, each ember carrying a fragment of her curse, a lingering imprint on the city she had haunted. Silence fell over the assembled villagers, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down like a shroud, a shared understanding that some events cannot be explained, cannot be rationalized, and must be feared. Even as the smoke dissipated, the widow's image remained etched in the minds of all who saw her, a terrifying and unforgettable vision. Her laughter, carried on the wind, echoed long after she vanished from the pyre, a haunting reminder that curses do not end with death, and that grief, when combined with dark powers, can manifest in forms that defy reason, logic, and mortal comprehension. Lisbon would whisper of this night for generations, a tale of terror and fascination, of a widow whose sorrow became legend, whose dance within fire would forever mark the city as a place touched by the macabre, the cursed, the unforgettable. Even centuries later, scholars, mystics, and wanderers passing through the foggy streets claim to feel a presence, a flicker of heat, a distant echo of laughter that reminds them that some darkness lingers, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be feared. Lisbon in the year 1837 was a city of contrasts, where opulent mansions stood beside narrow, crumbling alleyways, and the air was thick with the mingling scents of the sea and soot from countless chimneys. The city was still haunted by memories of the devastating earthquake that had struck decades before, leaving scars in both architecture and collective memory. Among the prominent families of Lisbon, the widow's lineage was respected, though whispers of peculiar behavior had always followed her family. Her father had been a scholar, obsessed with occult texts and forbidden knowledge, rumored to have dabbled in rites that blurred the lines between life and death. Her mother, a recluse, spent her days behind heavy drapes, muttering incantations and creating charms to ward off unseen forces, or perhaps to summon them. The widow had grown up in an environment where the natural and supernatural intertwined, where shadows carried meaning and silence could be a warning. By the time she married, she had already shown signs of fascination with death, often visiting graveyards at dusk, speaking softly to the departed, leaving flowers that never wilted. Her husband, a wealthy merchant, was both captivated and unsettled by her demeanor. He admired her grace and intelligence but could not fully comprehend the depths of her obsessions. Their marriage, though outwardly respectable, was fraught with tension beneath the surface. The widow's fascination with occult rituals intensified after his sudden death, which occurred under mysterious circumstances that many claimed were too coincidental to be natural. Some whispered of a strange illness, others murmured of foul play, yet no evidence ever surfaced. The funeral preparations reflected the widow's desire for control over her narrative. From the black-draped carriages to the ominous symbols she insisted be etched into the pyre. Onlookers noted her meticulous attention to detail, the precise alignment of candles, the specific choice of herbs, each element imbued with meaning she refused to explain. Scholars and clergy alike speculated about her motives, some suspecting a psychological break, others fearing that she wielded forces beyond mortal comprehension. The city's authorities, bound by duty yet hesitant to intervene, watched cautiously, unsure if her actions were eccentricity or something far darker. In private, the widow consulted texts and scrolls that chronicled forbidden knowledge, many of which had been confiscated or banned due to their dangerous content. She experimented with chants, rituals, and concoctions, seeking communion with entities that promised insight into the mysteries of death and the afterlife. Locals reported seeing her at night in abandoned gardens, performing silent dances, drawing sigils in the soil, and whispering to shadows that seemed to respond in kind. Her fascination was not merely academic. It had a visceral, almost predatory intensity. The widow's household became a nexus of unease. Servants too frightened to speak unless spoken to, animals avoiding the halls, and neighbors whispering warnings of strange lights and sounds emanating from within her estate. Even those who had known her as a girl could not reconcile the woman before them with the youthful innocence they remembered. She had transformed into someone both alluring and terrifying, a figure that seemed to exist between the natural and supernatural. Tales of her exploits reached the ears of wandering mystics and occultists, some of whom sought her out either in fear, fascination, or both. They described encounters that left them questioning reality, objects moving without touch, shadows shifting against logic, whispers that echoed truths they could not comprehend. The widow's reputation grew, fueled by both fear and intrigue, drawing more witnesses to her rituals, and the air around her home thickened with anticipation and dread. Scholars who documented her life noted that she did not simply exist in the city. She seemed to command the attention of the environment itself, the streets bending subtly to her presence, the wind carrying her intentions, the very light dimming or brightening according to her whims. This was the backdrop against which her infamous funeral would unfold, a city primed with fear, superstition, and a collective expectation that the widow's grief would manifest in extraordinary and terrifying ways. Her story was not merely one of personal tragedy, but of a lineage steeped in occult fascination, of a woman whose upbringing had prepared her to challenge the boundaries between life and death, reality and the supernatural. The streets whispered her name, the shadows seemed to bend toward her, and those who dared observe her movement sensed that history itself held its breath, waiting for the night when grief would turn to spectacle, and a widow's sorrow would ignite a city with fire, fear, and the echoes of something cursed. The widow's influence over Lisbon extended beyond her household. Her presence was felt in every corner of the city, in whispers between merchants, in wary glances of passers-by, and in the hushed conversations of clergy who feared her knowledge. Those who observed her closely reported that she moved with purpose, her every gesture calculated, her eyes always searching for unseen presences. At night, lights flickered in her home without explanation. Shadows danced along walls though no one was there, and servants often reported hearing chants or soft music that had no identifiable source. Scholars attempting to study her methods noted a terrifying precision in her actions, an understanding of forces that went beyond mere superstition or academic interest. The widow had mastered the art of creating fear and fascination simultaneously, ensuring that her reputation grew with every passing year. She corresponded with mysterious figures, some from distant lands, exchanging letters filled with cryptic instructions, diagrams, and references to entities unknown to ordinary human understanding. Her husband's death remained shrouded in suspicion. Some claimed the illness that struck him was natural. Others whispered of poison or ritual interference, yet no evidence ever emerged to satisfy the authorities. The widow used this ambiguity to further her control over perception. shaping her image as a woman whose sorrow had become entwined with forces that mortals could scarcely comprehend. Visitors to her home, often drawn by curiosity or scholarly pursuit, described an oppressive atmosphere, as though the walls themselves absorbed and reflected emotion. Candles burned without wind, paintings seemed to shift subtly, and mirrors revealed fleeting images that vanished when approached. Neighbors reported a persistent sense of unease, shadows that lingered in corners, a coldness that would descend without warning, and an occasional flicker of red light at the windows, always at night, always unexplained. These phenomena were documented in diaries, letters, and clandestine reports, forming a pattern that suggested the widow's mastery over her environment extended beyond superstition into something undeniably real. Scholars, mystics, and clergy debated her actions, some attributing them to natural talent in manipulation and psychology, others convinced she had tapped into dark, supernatural forces. Rumors of her nocturnal activities spread through the city, gatherings in hidden courtyards, whispered conversations with entities that had no corporeal form, and rituals performed with objects that carried symbolic power too ancient to understand. The widow's demeanor in public remained composed, elegant, and almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos and fear her presence inspired in those who knew her secrets. It was said that her knowledge of the occult allowed her to anticipate events, to manipulate outcomes subtly, ensuring that every action served her larger, hidden purpose. Even merchants and city officials who interacted with her regularly could not dismiss the sense that she was aware of more than she should be, that her perception extended beyond the natural senses. The day of her husband's funeral brought this influence to its peak. Preparations were meticulous, each detail carefully chosen to enhance the ritualistic nature of the event. Candles were arranged in specific patterns, herbs scattered along pathways, and symbols etched in ash and soil, all invisible to the untrained eye but potent to those versed in forbidden knowledge. Observers who were present described a palpable tension in the air, a collective unease that seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Even the wind behaved strangely, shifting direction without warning, carrying distant murmurs or faint chants that heightened the sense of dread. Townsfolk who had previously doubted the widow's capabilities now spoke in hushed tones of her potential to command forces beyond comprehension. Scholars who later examined records of the event noted that the widow's upbringing had uniquely prepared her to harness the city's fears, her grief acting as a conduit for power, transforming personal loss into an event that would haunt Lisbon for decades. The widow's story, her lineage, her environment, and her mastery of occult practices all converged to make the night of the funeral inevitable, a culmination of forces that combined human grief, supernatural influence, and the fascination of a city primed for fear. When she emerged for the funeral, draped in black and adorned with cryptic symbols, it was not merely the death of her husband being mourned, but the unveiling of a woman whose sorrow had become power, whose grief had transformed into something terrifyingly magnificent. Lisbon would remember the widow not for the life she lived, but for the darkness she embodied, for the fire she commanded, and for the cursed dance that would forever haunt the annals of the city's history. Shadows, whispers, and an enduring sense of dread lingered long after her presence faded, a testament to the inescapable influence of the cursed widow who walked between life, death, and forces beyond mortal comprehension. Every corner of the city seemed to retain fragments of her power, small disturbances that reminded residents that some legacies are indelible, some curses eternal, and that the widow's mastery over grief, fear, and the arcane had ensured her place in Lisbon's haunted memory. Scholars, chroniclers, and mystics who followed her story over the decades concluded unanimously that no ordinary explanation could suffice. Her life and actions had intertwined with forces unknown, creating a narrative where sorrow became spectacle, death became art, and grief became a legend that would endure long after flames cooled and witnesses aged into silence. In the weeks leading up to her husband's funeral, whispers of the widow's intentions spread like wildfire through Lisbon. Every tavern, every alley, and every market stall carried hushed rumors about the rituals she had been performing in secrecy. Witnesses claimed to have seen her wandering graveyards at night, leaving intricate patterns of ash and herbs, tracing symbols with movements that suggested both reverence and command. The widow's eyes, ever intense, seemed to burn with anticipation, as if she were communing with entities unseen by ordinary men. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in her wake, flickering against walls and doors, leaving onlookers unnerved by the subtle distortions of reality. Servants spoke of strange occurrences in her home, whispers that had no source, candles extinguishing and reigniting, and fleeting glimpses of figures moving in corners that should have been empty. These stories reached the city's scholars and clergy, sparking debates about the extent of her powers. Some argued that she had been practicing forbidden arts, while others suggested that grief had warped her mind, creating illusions that terrified all who encountered them. Despite the fear she inspired, a sense of fascination drew many closer, compelling them to observe her actions even as their hearts raced with dread. The widow's control over perception was remarkable. She cultivated an aura of inevitability, as if the city itself awaited her performance. On certain nights, she would be seen dancing alone in courtyards, her movements fluid and hypnotic, tracing arcs that seemed to manipulate shadows and fire alike. Animals avoided her presence, and the wind itself seemed to bend around her, carrying scents of burning herbs and faint traces of smoke that had no identifiable source. Travelers and mystics passing through Lisbon noted these phenomena and recorded accounts that would later serve as evidence of her extraordinary abilities. As the funeral approached, the widow intensified her preparations, ensuring that every detail would contribute to the atmosphere of dread and spectacle. Candles were positioned in precise geometrical patterns, herbs scattered along the pathways, and symbols etched in ash and soil to create a conduit of energy she alone could command. Even the city's natural elements seemed to obey her design. Gusts of wind would shift at her approach, clouds darkened overhead, and the temperature fluctuated unnaturally, sending shivers down the spines of those who dared observe her movements. Villagers who attempted to warn others about the widow's increasing obsession found themselves disbelieved, dismissed as fearful or superstitious. Yet on the eve of the funeral, unease reached its peak. Doors slammed without wind, shadows twisted in corners, and strange ethereal whispers filled empty streets, as if the city itself were warning of the horrors to come. The widow's behavior became more erratic, more intense, and more captivating. She spoke softly to herself, tracing sigils in the air, murmuring words and languages that had not been spoken in centuries. Those who glimpsed these moments described an aura of power that seemed to radiate from her very being, a force that compelled attention, even as it threatened to unravel sanity. Observers noted that the widow's movements, even when subtle, carried authority. Her gaze could command silence. Her gestures influenced the smallest details in her environment. Onlookers who tried to flee found themselves frozen, compelled to watch, unable to tear their eyes away from the unfolding prelude to the tragedy and spectacle of her husband's funeral. The city's historians would later document that the week before the event was filled with inexplicable phenomena. Fires that ignited and died without cause, shadows that moved independently, and animals behaving in ways that defied logic. Each incident added to the collective fear, ensuring that when the widow took her place upon the pyre, the city was primed to witness an event that would forever blur the line between grief, ritual, and supernatural spectacle. Her preparations were meticulous and purposeful, a symphony of fear, anticipation, and control. The widow did not simply mourn. She orchestrated, designed, and curated an experience that would etch her presence into the annals of Lisbon's dark history. Every detail, from the placement of objects to the subtle movements of her body, contributed to a building tension that no ordinary observer could withstand. Without being affected, both emotionally and psychologically, the city's residents, scholars, and visitors alike were caught in a web of dread and fascination, their curiosity intertwined with terror, a perfect stage for the widow's ultimate display. Shadows shifted, flames flickered, and the air thickened with expectation, each breath drawing witnesses closer to a reality they could not comprehend but could not escape. It was during this period that the widow's reputation solidified. She became more than a grieving widow. She was an omen, a figure of macabre power, a presence whose actions would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations. The stage was set, the city's collective anxiety at its peak, and the widow prepared to perform a ritual that would transform personal sorrow into legend, grief into spectacle, and fear into an indelible mark on Lisbon's history. As the day of the funeral dawned, Lisbon trembled under a heavy sky, clouds hanging low as though weighed down by the collective fear of the city's inhabitants. Word of the widow's preparations had spread, stirring anxiety, curiosity, and dread in equal measure. Streets were filled with those who wished to witness her final mourning, drawn by fascination even as apprehension gnawed at their hearts. Every observer felt the tension in the air, the subtle vibrations that hinted at forces beyond human understanding, a prelude to the horrors that would unfold. The widow moved through her estate with deliberate grace, checking each candle, adjusting herbs, and ensuring that the pyre's construction adhered perfectly to the symbols she had etched into her memory. Servants, too frightened to speak unless ordered, performed their duties in silence, eyes wide and hands trembling, aware that they were part of a spectacle that defied reason. The streets surrounding her home were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of commerce and life muted, as if the city itself held its breath in anticipation. Even animals seemed aware, birds circling nervously, dogs refusing to approach, and cats watching from hidden corners with unblinking eyes. The widow's gown shimmered under the dim light, black as morning yet alive with energy, symbols woven into the fabric seeming to shift when viewed from different angles. Her hair, meticulously arranged, caught faint glimmers of light, giving the impression of sparks, subtle yet unnerving to those who noticed. The gathering crowd, numbering in the hundreds, waited along the route, eyes fixed on the estate, hearts pounding with the thrill of fear. Some whispered that the widow's actions were not mere grief, but a channeling of forces older than Lisbon itself, ancient and unforgiving, powers that could alter reality and bend perception. As the hour approached, a stillness settled over the city, thick and suffocating as if time itself had slowed in respect, or fear, of what was about to occur. The widow emerged from her estate, her movements measured, deliberate, commanding attention without effort. Eyes followed her every step, and those who tried to look away found themselves unable, as though invisible threads had tethered their gaze to her. Candles flickered along the path, igniting with no discernible source, smoke rising in delicate spirals that seemed to respond to her presence, weaving an atmosphere of supernatural anticipation. She approached the pyre with a poise that defied mortal grief, each step resonating like a drumbeat echoing the city's collective heartbeat, a rhythm that drew observers deeper into fear and fascination. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward her as though acknowledging her command, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. Rumors circulated that the widow's grief had summoned entities to witness her ritual, spirits bound by sorrow and power, their presence manifesting in subtle distortions of light and sound. The pyre itself seemed to react, flames flickering before ignition as if sensing the approach of the widow, anticipation in every tendril of smoke. Witnesses claimed that the widow's gaze could command silence, her mere presence imposing a weight upon all within sight. Some felt faint, others trembled, yet all were compelled to remain, caught in a web of fear, wonder, and unspoken understanding that something extraordinary was about to unfold. As she stepped onto the pyre, the air grew thick, charged with heat, tension, and a tangible sense of the supernatural. The widow's movements became ritualistic, each gesture precise, each motion summoning attention and awe. Observers noted that the flames seemed to embrace her, coiling around her form without consuming her, a display of power that defied natural law. Smoke twisted into shapes, faces of the past and phantoms of imagination intertwining, creating visions both beautiful and horrifying. The widow's dance began slowly, a deliberate series of movements that mesmerized the crowd, blending grief with defiance, sorrow with power. Onlookers could feel the rhythm of her sorrow, a pulse that resonated through the city, connecting every heart to the spectacle before them. Shadows danced in tandem, wind shifted unpredictably, and the scent of herbs, smoke, and something unidentifiable filled the air, all conspiring to enhance the sense of dread and fascination. The widow's eyes glimmered with intent, a knowing awareness of the effect she had on those who watched, a mastery of fear and admiration simultaneously. Each step, each turn, heightened the tension, a crescendo building toward an inevitable climax, the city entranced, powerless to interrupt, unable to comprehend fully, yet unable to look away. This was the culmination of weeks of preparation, months of fascination, and a lifetime shaped by grief, power, and forbidden knowledge. Lisbon's citizens would forever remember this moment, the prelude to the widow's legendary dance within the flames, a haunting performance that blurred the lines between life death and the forces that lurk beyond mortal understanding. The moment of reckoning arrived as the widow stepped fully onto the pyre, the flames curling around her like obedient serpents, refusing to consume her. The crowd, 100 strong, watched in silent horror, hearts pounding, eyes wide, as the widow's body moved with an elegance that defied fear and logic. Each step, each twirl seemed to command the fire, bending its heat and light into patterns that hypnotized and terrified. Smoke twisted skyward, forming grotesque faces and shadowy figures that flickered and vanished, leaving the spectators questioning whether their eyes deceived them. The widow's gown, alive with sparks, shifted with every motion, black fabric glowing as if infused with cursed energy. Her hair glimmered like molten embers, casting reflections on nearby walls, igniting fleeting hallucinations in those who dared to stare. Some fainted, others clutched each other in panic. Yet no one could avert their gaze, trapped by the widow's command and the unearthly spectacle before them. Whispers spread through the crowd, voices trembling. She dances with death itself. She is no longer human. The flames obey her. The widow's eyes glinted with a mixture of grief, rage and triumph, revealing the depth of power she had cultivated over years of obsession, study, and communion with forces unseen. Every motion was deliberate, choreographed as though part of a dark ritual written in fire, a language only she and the elements could comprehend. The flames licked higher, yet her body remained unscathed, a phenomenon that defied all understanding and reason. Some claimed to see shapes forming in the smoke, the face of her deceased husband twisted in agony, spirits of those long dead rising to witness the macabre display, shadows of animals and men moving in unnatural synchronization. The widow's dance was both mourning and invocation, grief and power intertwined in a terrifyingly beautiful expression of supernatural mastery. Each spin drew the eyes of the crowd, bending perception, warping reality, forcing onlookers to confront forces that should not exist. The fire's heat was palpable yet strangely tolerable, an unnatural accommodation that further fueled the sense of cursed awe. Observers described a hum in the air, faint yet omnipresent, a vibration that resonated with the widow's movements, amplifying fear and fascination. The widow's hands traced sigils in the smoke, movements precise, invoking energies both ancient and forbidden. Shadows on the ground stretched and coiled around her, interacting with the flames as though sentient, responding to her will and the sorrow that radiated from her core. The crowd could feel the tension coiling like a living thing, pressing upon them, compelling focus and amplifying terror. The widow's presence dominated the pyre, the fire, the sky, and the minds of all who observed, a central point of power, grief, and cursed beauty. As the minutes passed, the flames danced in harmony with her movements, curling higher, casting macabre reflections on nearby walls, rooftops, and faces. The widow's hair and gown became extensions of the pyre, a fusion of mortal form and elemental force that seemed impossible, yet undeniable. Some witnesses reported hearing whispers not from other humans but from the flames themselves, secrets carried in the crackle of fire, messages from realms unseen. The widow's pace quickened, spinning faster, her steps sharper, each movement commanding more energy, more attention, more fear. Smoke spiraled into complex patterns, twisting into faces, hands, and figures that disappeared as quickly as they emerged, leaving a lingering impression of unease and wonder. The widow's grief had transformed into a performance of unparalleled power, a macabre spectacle that fused mortality with supernatural force. Observers could feel an almost tangible energy radiating from her, filling the air with heat, anticipation, and an inexplicable sense of inevitability. Some attempted to flee, only to find their feet heavy, their minds entranced by the widow's display. Even the city's environment seemed complicit. Wind currents shifted to carry scents of burning herbs, the firelight casting long, unnatural shadows, and clouds overhead swirling as though observing the scene below. The widow's movements were no longer merely physical. They had become a manifestation of her grief, a conduit of power, a cursed expression of sorrow and defiance that engulfed the city's attention and imagination. The flames rose higher still, yet they respected her form, bending around her like a living entity, acknowledging the presence of something greater than human comprehension. Every twist, turn, and gesture contributed to the crescendo of terror and fascination that gripped Lisbon, ensuring that the widow's cursed legacy would be etched into memory forever. The pyre roared, yet consumed nothing. The widow's dance became a nexus of fire, grief, and supernatural power, a haunting performance that defied mortal understanding, leaving all who watched in awe, terror, and disbelief. The widow's dance reached its terrifying apex as the pyre burned hotter, flames coiling around her form yet leaving her untouched, a spectacle that defied nature and comprehension. The crowd watched, frozen between fear and fascination, unable to turn away, hearts pounding in unison with the rhythm of the cursed performance. Each movement of her body traced invisible sigils in the air, weaving a pattern that seemed to draw the city itself into the ritual, binding the streets, the wind, and the shadows into her orchestration. Smoke spiraled in intricate patterns, forming fleeting visions of human agony, animalistic contortions, and ghostly faces that vanished the moment they were fully seen. The widow's hair glittering with ember-like sparks and her flowing gown of blackened silk fused with the fire, creating an image that seemed less mortal than divine, less living than elemental. Observers whispered of hearing distant cries within the crackling flames, voices of the damned or perhaps echoes of the widow's own anguish amplified by unseen forces. The intensity of her movements grew, her spins faster, her gestures more commanding as if calling forth the full extent of the supernatural power she had cultivated over years of study, grief, and obsession. Shadows along the pyre's perimeter seemed to stretch and reach, mimicking her movements, dancing alongside her in a macabre harmony that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Flames leapt higher, casting grotesque reflections on nearby walls, rooftops, and faces, magnifying the collective fear and awe. Some fainted from the heat, the shock, or the unrelenting pressure of the scene, while others clung desperately to companions, eyes wide, hearts racing, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the spectacle before them. The widow's eyes glinted with intent, revealing both sorrow and triumph, a recognition that her grief had become art, her mourning a conduit for forces beyond mortal reckoning. The pyre's flames seemed to respond to her emotion, twisting into shapes that reflected her inner turmoil, spirals of shadowed hands, faces of lost souls, serpentine flickers of smoke that wound upward, vanishing into the heavy clouds above. The air carried the scent of burnt herbs, something metallic and the faint tang of something unnameable, a combination that unsettled stomachs and minds alike. Even the wind seemed to obey her rhythm, swirling to carry smoke and whispers across the streets, affecting the crowd's perception, pulling them deeper into the hypnotic terror. The widow's gestures became more elaborate, each step, each twirl, each extension of her arms a deliberate command over fire and shadow, weaving together grief, rage, and invocation into a tapestry of unearthly power. Observers noted with horror that the fire did not consume. It amplified, elevating the widow into a figure of near mythical presence, a cursed widow who had transcended mortality through sorrow and ritual. Faint whispers spread across the crowd. Some claimed they felt spirits brush past them. Others swore they heard their own names called in tones that were both familiar and chillingly wrong. The widow's spinning created an aura of heat and energy, bending the senses, making the impossible feel real, forcing the city's inhabitants to confront a performance that could not be explained by science or faith. Smoke coalesced into moving forms, shadows twisted in response, and the widow's gaze seemed to penetrate to the deepest fears of all who dared watch. Each motion, precise and deliberate, carried the weight of her past, her lineage, and the secrets she had cultivated over a lifetime steeped in forbidden knowledge. Her grief became a weapon, her sorrow a performance, her mourning a catalyst for forces that bent the natural order. Even the tallest observers, men who had faced calamity and plague, found themselves trembling, eyes fixed, hearts racing, powerless before the widow's orchestration of fire, shadow, and spectral terror. As minutes stretched into what felt like eternity, the widow's final movements drew the flames to a crescendo, spiraling higher, casting grotesque silhouettes that would remain in the memories of witnesses for decades. And in that moment, as her dance reached perfection, the city itself seemed to acknowledge the culmination. A hush descended over Lisbon, the collective breath held as if the entire world waited in fear and reverence. The widow's form, enmeshed with fire and shadow, had become immortal in the eyes of all who watched, a cursed symbol of grief transformed into spectacle, sorrow into power, and mortality into legend. When the flames finally began to settle, the widow stood unscathed, her gown tattered yet glowing with residual energy, her eyes blazing with a mixture of triumph, defiance, and eternal sorrow. Witnesses would later describe the silence that followed as deafening, the air thick with a lingering charge, a city forever marked by a night when fire, grief, and dark power converged in a dance no one would ever forget. Shadows remained long after the pyre dimmed. Whispers echoed through alleyways, and a sense of unease permeated Lisbon for years, a constant reminder that the widow's legacy was one of cursed immortality, grief transmuted into terror, and a performance that had bridged the mortal and the supernatural. The morning after the widow's infernal dance, Lisbon awoke to a city forever altered, streets silent, cobblestones scorched, and a lingering haze of smoke that seemed to whisper of the horrors witnessed the night before. Citizens ventured cautiously from their homes, eyes wide, hearts still pounding, as if expecting the widow to emerge from the mist at any moment, her cursed presence an unrelenting shadow over the city. Rumors spread faster than fire. Some claimed that witnesses had been touched by spirits during the dance. Others whispered that the widow had bound her own soul to the flames, ensuring her grief would never end. Scholars arrived from distant regions drawn by reports of the unholy spectacle, their minds struggling to reconcile eyewitness accounts with natural laws, their notebooks filling with desperate attempts at rational explanation. Many who had observed the event spoke of visions that would haunt them indefinitely. Fleeting faces in the smoke, shadows that moved independently, whispers of names never spoken aloud, and sensations of cold or heat that had no apparent source. Local clergy convened secret councils, debating whether intervention was possible, if curses could be lifted, and if the widow herself could be confronted without catastrophic consequences. Attempts to approach her estate met with unease. Servants refused entry to outsiders, claiming that the widow had vanished into hidden chambers. Her presence felt but unseen, her energy saturating every corner of the house. Some townsfolk swore that the widow had ascended beyond human form during her dance, her body no longer entirely mortal, her grief transmuted into something eternal and terrifying. The aftermath became a study in fear. Fires that had been extinguished would reignite inexplicably. Shadows lingered longer than natural, and the air carried an unplaceable chill, a residual effect of the widow's ritual and the cursed power she had invoked. Children who had glimpsed the spectacle were said to wake screaming, haunted by visions of flames, twisting shadows, and the widow's blazing eyes. Merchants and officials attempted to resume normal life, yet even mundane activities were overshadowed by the memory of that night. Every flicker of light or crackle of fire invoking recollections of horror and fascination. Scholars and mystics documented these phenomena, attempting to catalog the widow's methods, her symbols, and her interactions with the environment. Yet every analysis yielded more questions than answers. The city itself seemed to react. Alleyways became narrower, winds more capricious, and fog lingered in streets longer than memory allowed, as if Lisbon itself had absorbed the curse and refused to release it. Servants who remained in her household reported continued disturbances, doors creaking open and shut, objects moving, and the faint echo of her laughter carried by the wind, each event reinforcing the legend of her supernatural influence. Many feared to speak openly, but whispered accounts painted a picture of a widow whose sorrow had become eternal, whose mourning had defied death, and whose power was now an inseparable part of the city's psyche. Historians would later describe the aftermath as a mixture of terror, awe, and fascination, the widow's actions elevating grief to a performance that transcended ordinary human experience. Letters exchanged between scholars discussed the psychological impact on witnesses, the manipulation of fear, and the apparent ability to bend perception, suggesting that her grief had become both ritual and weapon. Merchants who had observed the event noted unusual economic behavior. Customers hesitant to enter shops near her estate, trade slowed, and an unspoken tension that affected commerce, reflecting the psychological grip the widow's actions had imposed on the city. Even travelers passing through Lisbon reported feeling the weight of the widow's presence, a lingering aura that could not be shaken, a reminder that some performances leave permanent marks beyond the immediate spectacle. The widow herself remained unseen for days, yet her influence was omnipresent. Shadows stretched unnaturally, smoke rose without source, and the temperature fluctuated in ways that defied explanation. Scholars debated whether her disappearance was voluntary or the result of supernatural consequence, whether she had transcended mortality, or if her grief had bound her to the very flames she had danced within. The impact on the city's culture was immediate. Artists, writers, and mystics referenced her in poems, drawings, and secretive journals, embedding her cursed presence into Lisbon's collective memory. Every mention, every depiction carried a sense of awe and terror, reinforcing the narrative that the widow had walked beyond human comprehension and returned, leaving behind an indelible imprint of fear and fascination. Even years later, residents reported fleeting glimpses of a figure in black moving among the fog, a shadow that vanished when approached, a whisper of laughter in deserted streets, all reminders that the widow's performance had not ended with the extinguishing of the flames. Lisbon's collective consciousness had been altered. Grief had been transformed into power, fear into legend, and a widow's mourning into a spectacle that would echo through generations. Days turned into weeks, and Lisbon remained in the widow's shadow, the city unwilling to return to normalcy. Every street corner seemed to echo her presence. Every flicker of flame reminded citizens of the cursed spectacle, and every whisper in the night carried her name. Scholars and mystics traveled from distant lands seeking to understand the phenomenon, yet none could fully explain how grief, ritual, and supernatural influence had converged so completely. Witnesses reported lingering visions, flickers of flames behind closed doors, shadows twisting into her likeness, and a persistent hum in the air that seemed to resonate with her sorrow. Some claimed that those who had been closest to the pyre were marked forever, their dreams haunted by visions of fire, smoke, and the widow's blazing eyes, a psychological imprint that refused to fade. Religious authorities debated whether intervention was possible, whether prayers, blessings, or rites could sever the connection she had forged with forces beyond human comprehension. Many feared that any attempt to confront her directly could provoke unimaginable consequences, that her grief had become a conduit for power that could not be challenged without risking catastrophe. Merchants and city officials continued their work under the oppressive weight of collective fear, their daily routines overshadowed by the memory of the widow's dance and the cursed energy that lingered in the air. Even the natural environment seemed altered. Fog hung longer in streets where she had performed. Winds shifted unpredictably, and temperatures rose or fell inexplicably, as if the city itself remained tethered to her ritual. Reports of strange phenomena persisted. Candles extinguished on their own, objects moved inexplicably, and whispers of unintelligible words drifted through alleyways, reinforcing the legend that the widow's influence extended beyond physical presence. Servants who remained in her household described subtle disturbances, faint flickers of movement in empty rooms, shadows stretching unnaturally, and an occasional sensation of being watched, all signs that the widow's presence had permeated the very structure of her home. Scholars attempting to document her methods found themselves frustrated. Notes failed to capture the totality of the event. Diagrams were inadequate, and witness testimonies conflicted, each adding layers to the legend rather than clarifying it. Over time, the widow's story became inseparable from Lisbon itself, a haunting narrative that intertwined history, fear, and fascination. Artists and writers depicted her in dark sketches, poems, and secret journals, creating a cultural memory of grief transmuted into spectacle. These works perpetuated her cursed presence, ensuring that even generations removed from the original event could feel the echo of her power. Local children were told stories of the widow as cautionary tales. The moral embedded in fear, grief when wielded with knowledge and obsession, could transcend mortality and leave marks that endured beyond life. Travelers passing through Lisbon reported an uneasy sensation, a prickling at the back of the neck, an unexplainable weight in the air, all attributed to the widow's lingering influence. Some even claimed fleeting glimpses of her figure moving among foggy streets, vanishing when approached, a spectral presence that confirmed the legend. Religious authorities continued to debate in secret chambers, some advocating protective measures for the city, others resigned to the notion that the widow's curse was permanent, a scar on Lisbon that could not be healed. Merchants reported that trade and commerce were subtly affected. Fear influenced decisions, altered routes, and created hesitation in routine transactions, reflecting the psychological impact of the widow's actions. The city became a repository of stories, visions, and unexplained phenomena, each reinforcing the notion that the widow had transcended normal grief to achieve a form of cursed immortality. Residents noted that minor disturbances, flickering lights, sudden chills, whispers in empty streets, often coincided with anniversaries of her husband's death or the night of the pyre, as though the widow's energy had embedded a cycle into the city itself. Even decades later, reports persisted. Distant observers, historians, and wandering mystics recorded uncanny events, small but undeniable, suggesting that the widow's dance had created a lasting impression on both human and environmental consciousness. Lisbon, for generations, remained tethered to the night of the widow's infernal performance. A city forever haunted, transformed, and marked by grief turned into power, ritual turned into spectacle, and mortality turned into legend. In every shadow, in every flicker of flame, the legacy of the cursed widow endured, a chilling reminder that sorrow, when fused with forbidden knowledge and relentless will, could alter the very fabric of reality, leaving an indelible, terrifying mark on history. Despite the widow's disappearance from public view, the events of her cursed funeral left Lisbon enveloped in unresolved questions, a haze of speculation and pervasive fear. Scholars, mystics, and clergy alike debated endlessly, attempting to discern whether her power had been supernatural or an extraordinary manipulation of psychology, perception, and ritual. Witnesses continued to report anomalies, shadows that seemed sentient, whispers in empty alleys, flickers of fire without source, and faint, untraceable heat that would rise in her absence. These phenomena defied conventional understanding, leaving even the most learned authorities baffled. Some theorized that the widow had forged a connection to spirits or entities beyond human comprehension, using grief as a conduit to bend the natural laws, while others feared she had bound her own soul to the pyre, achieving a form of cursed immortality. Researchers who attempted to study her estate noted subtle distortions, furniture shifting slightly, objects out of place with no explanation, and recurring impressions of movement when no one was present. Local folklore transformed the widow into an archetype of cursed mourning, a figure whose grief bridged life and death, whose sorrow remained a lingering force influencing the city long after her body was no longer seen. Testimonies varied, yet a consistent pattern emerged. Those closest to the pyre or who observed the widow's dance felt permanent psychological effects, dreams haunted by fire and shadows, waking sensations of heat and whispering voices, and an enduring fear that defied rational explanation. Even years later, chroniclers noted recurring phenomena that coincided with anniversaries of her husband's death, as if her sorrow had embedded itself into the temporal fabric of Lisbon, creating a cycle of haunting recollections and supernatural disturbances. Attempts to perform rituals to break the perceived curse often failed. Priests, mystics, and occultists reported interference, subtle forces that countered their measures, reinforcing the notion that the widow had tapped into something older, persistent, and indifferent to human intervention. Scholars debated the authenticity of eyewitness accounts, yet the consistency and volume of reports lent them credibility that could not be easily dismissed. Letters, diaries, and clandestine notes described ephemeral figures and shadows, distorted reflections in mirrors, and faint silhouettes moving against logic, all attributed to the widow's lingering presence. Some believed she had merged with the elemental forces of fire and shadow, her grief anchoring her to the city while freeing her from mortality, creating a spectral existence that remained intertwined with the environment. Locals continued to speak of a presence near her estate, strange lights flickering at night, faint traces of burnt herbs, and sudden drops in temperature, suggesting that the widow's influence had not dissipated but instead permeated every corner of her domain. Reports of animals reacting to unseen stimuli, dogs growling at empty air, cats arching toward nothing visible, added to the growing perception that supernatural forces lingered. Scholars attempting to reconstruct the events noted discrepancies that only deepened the mystery. Smoke patterns inconsistent with natural fire, shadows behaving independently, and visual phenomena that could not be replicated under controlled conditions. Mystics who visited the widow's home claimed to feel her grief, a tangible presence that weighed on the chest, a sorrow so potent it resonated across space and time, bending perception and unsettling even the most rational minds. Rumors persisted of secret gatherings of occultists and scholars who attempted to communicate with the widow's spirit, each endeavor ending in inexplicable failure, strange accidents, or fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures that vanished before explanation. Some accounts suggested that she had learned to manipulate the collective consciousness of those who observed her, creating hallucinations, fears, and awe that persisted long after the flames had died. The city itself became a participant in her curse, Fogs thickened unpredictably. Winds carried whispers and shadows lingered in corners far longer than reason allowed. These phenomena ensured that Lisbon remained haunted, a city unable to separate itself from the widow's grief, her ritual, and the enigmatic forces she had summoned. Even centuries later, historians and paranormal investigators reference the event as a case study in cursed mourning, a perfect confluence of grief, ritual, and inexplicable influence that left a permanent mark on human and environmental consciousness. The widow's legacy endured not only in stories but in the subtle disturbances that plagued the city. Faint flickers of light, unexpected shadows, unexplained noises, and the persistent sense that her presence lingered, observing, influencing, and shaping the perceptions of all who dwelled there. Her actions had created a mystery that defied closure, a narrative of cursed mourning that intertwined history, grief, and the supernatural in ways that no investigation could resolve fully. Lisbon remained suspended in the aftermath, caught between the tangible and intangible, the known and unknown, haunted by a widow whose grief had transcended mortality and whose influence had become an enduring force of fear, fascination, and unanswerable questions. The widow's influence on Lisbon extended far beyond those who had witnessed her dance. Reports of unexplainable phenomena persisted in neighborhoods surrounding her estate for decades. Residents spoke of flickering shadows that mimicked human movement, faint traces of smoke that carried the scent of herbs long since burned, and a subtle hum in the night air that seemed to vibrate in tune with some unseen force. Scholars attempting to study these occurrences were confounded by their persistence and unpredictability, finding that instruments and recordings could not capture the full extent of what humans perceived, leaving them to rely on eyewitness testimony and anecdotal accounts. Folklorists noted that tales of the widow were passed down through generations, evolving into cautionary legends warning against grief untempered by reason, mourning amplified into dangerous obsession, and curiosity drawn into perilous observation. Visitors to Lisbon sometimes reported inexplicable chills, sudden shadows crossing their vision, and whispers of names never spoken aloud, all suggesting the city remained tethered to her presence in subtle, disturbing ways. Some speculated that her mastery over fire and shadow had created a lingering imprint in the very environment, a supernatural resonance that refused to dissipate with time, embedding her grief and power into the streets, buildings, and even the air itself. Attempts to revisit the pyre site were met with unease. Uneven scorched earth, lingering smoke, and subtle distortions in perception contributed to the sense that the area was cursed, a nexus of grief, fire, and supernatural force. Scholars debated whether the widow's disappearance was voluntary or a consequence of her ritual. Some argued she had transcended mortality entirely, merging with elemental forces to exist as a spectral presence that could manipulate the environment at will. Others feared she remained trapped within the flames, cursed to dance eternally, her grief a permanent anchor between life and death. Local clergy attempted blessings, protective rituals, and prayers, yet interference, subtle accidents, and unexplainable disturbances suggested that her influence could not be mitigated by conventional spiritual means. The mystery of the widow's power became a subject of obsession for those who studied occult phenomena, grief, and ritualized expression, with each account only deepening the sense of unresolvable enigma surrounding her life and actions. Residents continued to report psychological effects, nightmares, unexplained anxiety, fleeting visions of fire and shadow, and the impression of being watched, all traced back to encounters with the widow or her cursed estate. Attempts to document the patterns were inconclusive. Events appeared random, yet observers consistently noted that anniversaries of her husband's death or the funeral pyre triggered more intense manifestations. Paranormal investigators described disturbances that seemed to respond to human presence, suggesting the widow's grief had become a persistent force, capable of interacting with perception and consciousness. A haunting echo that blurred the lines between physical and metaphysical. Stories circulated of hidden symbols etched into walls and pavements, traces of her ritual that continued to exert influence, though subtle, over those who unknowingly crossed them. Legends evolved, warning that those who sought too much knowledge about the widow risked obsession, madness, or permanent entanglement with forces beyond comprehension. Even scientific observers struggled to explain anomalies, thermal irregularities, unexplained shadows, and fleeting movements that could not be measured or repeated. Some argued that the widow's dance had not only bound her grief, but also manipulated the city itself, creating a network of residual energy that maintained her presence across time. Tales of sightings persisted. Fleeting glimpses of a woman in black moving through fog, shadows that seemed to follow observers, and occasional whispers echoing names or incantations, all reinforcing the belief that her influence had not diminished. The widow became a figure of perpetual fascination and dread, a cautionary example of grief transformed into power, and of human experience intersecting with forces beyond understanding. Her story blurred the line between history and legend, reality and supernatural, leaving Lisbon as a city haunted by the memory, presence, and unanswered questions surrounding a widow whose sorrow had become eternal. The unanswered questions remained. Had she truly transcended mortality? Were the phenomena purely psychological, or evidence of forces unperceived by conventional science? And would Lisbon ever be free from the lingering imprint of grief, ritual, and cursed performance that she had left behind? The mystery persisted, unresolved and unyielding, a testament to the enduring power of the widow's grief, her ritual mastery, and the cursed legacy she had embedded within the city itself. The widow's tale, woven through fire, grief, and shadow, reached its haunting conclusion not with closure but with enduring resonance, a presence that continued to infiltrate Lisbon's streets, alleys, and consciousness long after the flames had cooled. Scholars, mystics, and observers reflected on the events, struggling to reconcile the undeniable spectacle with mortal comprehension, each detail meticulously recorded, yet never fully explained. Her grief, transmuted into power and ritual, had left an indelible mark, an echo of sorrow so profound it defied decay, persisting in perception, memory, and the environment itself. Residents reported subtle changes that became permanent. Shadows stretched unnaturally along walls, breezes carried untraceable scents of herbs and smoke, and fires flared briefly without cause, all interpreted as remnants of her cursed presence. Artists captured her in sketches, etchings, and paintings, each depiction attempting to distill the essence of grief transformed into a performance of supernatural magnitude. Writers immortalized her story in prose and poetry, embedding the widow's legacy into the cultural consciousness, a cautionary yet mesmerizing chronicle of sorrow, obsession, and unearthly mastery. Even those who had not witnessed the infamous pyre felt its impact. Families recounted tales of ancestral sightings, odd shadows, and inexplicable fires, ensuring that her narrative remained alive across generations. Scholars debated the mechanisms of her power, proposing theories that ranged from psychological manipulation to supernatural communion, yet none could satisfactorily account for the unbroken chain of phenomena that followed her presence. The widow had achieved a rare and terrifying form of immortality, not in body, but in the persistent influence she exerted on human perception, environment, and collective memory. Some speculated she had merged with elemental forces, her essence embedded in fire, smoke, and shadow, tethered to the city and its inhabitants, ensuring her grief and will endured beyond mortality. This persistent influence affected the city's rhythm. Streets became quieter at night, the fog thickened near her former estate, and a sense of foreboding settled over events connected to anniversaries of her husband's death. Residents whispered that minor disturbances, candle flames flickering, shadows elongating, faint whispers, were manifestations of her enduring presence, small yet persistent reminders that her story remained alive and potent. Mystics who attempted communication reported fleeting visions, a flicker of a black gown, ember-like sparks in the air, and a sensation of observation. Evidence, they claimed, that the widow's spirit had not dissipated, but existed in a liminal state between the living and the supernatural. Even secular observers noted the effect on human behavior. Anxiety near her former residence, hesitation in routine activities, and a heightened awareness of surroundings, as if some unseen energy influenced attention and perception. Lisbon's historians, when recounting the event centuries later, consistently emphasized the duality of fascination and terror, the way grief had been elevated into a performance that transcended ordinary experience, leaving an imprint not just on memory, but on the very fabric of the city. Attempts to rationalize or demystify her actions often fell short. Technological, psychological, and scientific explanations could not encompass the totality of the widow's influence. In private correspondence, scholars debated whether her mastery over grief, perception, and ritual might be replicable, or if it was uniquely bound to her essence. her experience and the convergence of timing, emotion, and circumstance. Her story also served as a cultural touchstone, a reminder of the power of human emotion and obsession to create experiences that challenge comprehension, blur boundaries, and linger in memory, environment, and psyche. Observers noted the persistence of symbolic elements, markings etched into surfaces, traces of ritual components, and environmental anomalies, all forming a network of residual influence that perpetuated her legacy. Even long after the city rebuilt, repaired, and moved forward, subtle manifestations remained, like whispers carried by the wind, glimpses of movement in the corner of the eye, and the occasional flaring of fire without cause. Families recounted these phenomena in hushed tones, the widow's tale a permanent fixture in Lisbon folklore, her grief and mastery of ritual forming a narrative that was terrifying yet captivating, a story of mourning transformed into enduring legend. In essence, the widow had achieved a form of immortality, not through physical preservation but through the meticulous orchestration of grief, fire, and ritualized performance, creating a legacy that persisted in perception, memory, and the environment, influencing those who dared witness, hear, or imagine her cursed presence. Lisbon's identity itself became intertwined with her story, her sorrow embedded in the city's collective consciousness, a haunting reminder that some acts of grief, when executed with knowledge, obsession, and forbidden understanding, defy closure and remain eternally potent. As years passed, the widow's presence continued to haunt Lisbon, her legacy woven into the city's very atmosphere, an indelible mark of grief, power, and cursed artistry. Residents reported fleeting glimpses of a shadowy figure in fog-laden streets, a trace of black silk moving unnaturally, accompanied by faint flickers of ember-like sparks in the air. These sightings, though brief and unprovable, reinforced the city's collective memory of the widow, cementing her as both legend and warning. Scholars analyzing these phenomena were divided. Some insisted the manifestations were psychological echoes, a byproduct of fear and suggestion, while others argued they were tangible evidence of her supernatural influence, her grief anchoring her presence beyond the boundaries of mortality. Visitors to Lisbon often sensed a peculiar energy near her former estate. Temperature shifts, shadows that defied logic, and whispers carried on the wind, hinting that the widow's mastery of ritual and sorrow had created an enduring resonance in space and consciousness alike. Artists and writers continued to draw inspiration from her story, producing works steeped in macabre beauty, their portrayals of the widow emphasizing her dual nature, a grieving mortal and a supernatural force, a figure who had transformed sorrow into spectacle, mortality into legend. These creative expressions ensured that her memory remained vivid, transmitted across generations, each retelling amplifying the mystery and power surrounding her life and actions. Residents recounted incidents that seemed connected to the widow's energy, shadows elongating without cause, faint traces of smoke lingering in empty rooms, and unexplained movements of objects, subtle but unnerving reminders of the night her dance had changed Lisbon forever. Some families passed down personal accounts of dreams in which flames and shadows interacted with a figure in black, the widow's sorrow palpable, the experience leaving lasting impressions on psyche and perception. Religious authorities debated whether any rites could mitigate her influence. Protective prayers, blessings, and ceremonies were attempted, yet subtle disturbances persisted, suggesting her power could not be constrained by conventional spiritual methods. Mystics visiting her former home often left shaken, claiming to feel a presence that weighed upon them, a sorrow so intense it seemed to pulse through the air, bending perception and reminding them of the widow's enduring mastery of grief and ritual. Even centuries later, historians reference the widow as a pivotal example of cursed mourning. Grief elevated into ritualized spectacle, transforming human emotion into a lasting force that altered environment, consciousness, and collective memory. Urban legends flourished, recounting fleeting encounters with the widow, unexplained shadows and whispering winds, ensuring her presence remained tangible in the city's psyche. Scientific observers documented minor anomalies, thermal fluctuations, subtle distortions of light and shadow, and ephemeral movements that could not be explained, attributing them to residual influence of her ritual, yet unable to replicate or control these phenomena. Families reported that on anniversaries of her husband's death or the pyre, these disturbances intensified, shadows grew longer, and whispers became more distinct, suggesting a cyclical pattern embedded into the city's temporal and environmental fabric. The widow's story became inseparable from Lisbon itself, a narrative of grief transmuted into power, mortality confronted and transcended, and a lesson on the consequences of obsession, ritual, and forbidden knowledge. Even distant travelers and scholars sensed the city's lingering unease, remarking on the oppressive atmosphere, subtle distortions, and fleeting shadows, all traced to the widow's enduring influence. Her legacy endured as a haunting reminder that human emotion, when meticulously harnessed through ritual and obsession, can leave marks far beyond mortal comprehension, altering perception, environment, and the course of cultural memory. Lisbon's identity absorbed her story. Streets, fog, and shadows carried the imprint of grief transformed into power, ensuring that no generation could entirely separate itself from the haunting echo of the widow's presence. The city became a living monument to cursed mourning, a space where memory, fear, and supernatural resonance coexisted, and where her sorrow, once mortal, remained an active, enduring force. Her tale concluded not with peace or resolution, but with persistence. Grief, ritual, and performance intertwined to create a haunting, eternal imprint that would continue to challenge, terrify, and fascinate anyone who dared to witness or imagine her presence. Lisbon and the world would never forget the cursed widow who had danced in the flames of her own funeral, a figure whose sorrow had achieved immortality, leaving behind a legacy as tragic, haunting, and unforgettable as the fire she had commanded.